personally think that porn and the availability of porn is a real detriment to the developing brain. Along those lines, I've heard you say that in order to reset the dopamine system, essentially in order to break an addictive pattern, to become unaddicted, 30 days of zero interaction with that substance, that person, etc.
Right.
Is that correct?
Yeah. And 30 days is, in my clinical experience, the average amount of time it takes for the brain to reset reward pathways, for dopamine transmission to regenerate itself. There's also a little bit of science that suggests that that's true. Some imaging studies showing that our brains are still in a dopamine deficit state 2 weeks after we've been using our drug. And then a study by Schuckett and Brown, which took a group of depressed men who also were addicted to alcohol, put them in a hospital where they had received no treatment for depression, but they had no access to alcohol in that time. And after 4 weeks, 80% of them no longer met criteria for major depression. So again, this idea that by depriving ourselves of this high dopamine, high reward substance or behavior, we allow our brains to regenerate its own dopamine for the balance to really equilibrate. And then we're in a place where we can sort of enjoy other things.
So that progressive narrowing of what brings one pleasure eventually expands. So I'd like to dissect out that 30 days a little more finely. And I also want to address, how does one stop doing something for 30 days if the thing is a thought? So we'll kind of put that on the shelf for the moment. So days 1 through 10, I would imagine will be very uncomfortable.
Yes.
They're going to suck, basically, to be quite honest, because the way you describe this pleasure-pain balance, to my mind, says that if you remove what little pleasure one is getting, or a lot of pleasure from engaging in some behavior, that's gone. The pain system is really ramped up, and nothing is making me feel good. I'll just use myself as an example. I'm not in recovery, but that 10 days is going to be miserable.
Right.
Anxiety, trouble sleeping, physical agitation, and to the point where, maybe impulsive, angry. Should one expect all of that? Should the family members of people expect all of that?
Yeah. So what I say to patients, and it's a really important piece of this intervention, is that you will feel worse before you feel better.
For how long?
Yeah.
This is probably the first question they ask, right?
And I say, usually in my clinical experience, you'll feel worse for 2 weeks. But if you can make it through those first 2 weeks, the sun will start to come out in week 3. And by week 4, most people are feeling a whole lot better than they were before they stopped using their substance. So you have to, it's a hard thing. Like, you have to sign up for it. And I will say, obviously, there are people with addictions that are so severe that as long as they have access to their drug or behavior, they're not able to stop themselves. And that's why we have, higher levels of care or residential treatment. So this is not going to be for everybody, this intervention, but it's amazing how many people with really severe addictions to things like heroin, cocaine, very severe pornography addictions. I posit this, and I do it as an experiment. I said, let's try this experiment. I'm always amazed, number one, how many of them are willing, and number two, how many of them are actually able to do it. They are able to do it. And so that little nudge is sort of just what they need. And the carrot is, there's a better life out there for you, and you'll be able to taste it in a month. You really will be able to begin to see that you can feel better and that there's another way.
So the way you describe it seems like it's hard. But it's doable for most people, not everybody.
Right.
And we'll return to that category of people who can't do that on their own. Then days 21 through 30, people are feeling better. The sun is starting to come out, as you mentioned, which translates in the narrative we've created here and supported by biology, that dopamine is starting to be released in response to the taste of a really good cup of coffee, for instance.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas before it was only to insert addictive behavior.
Right. That's right.
Whichever.
Of course,
it happens
coffee
to be.
can be addictive too, but we'll leave that
Sure.
aside.
Yeah. I feel like coffee has a kind of consumption limiting mechanism built in where at some point you just can't ingest anymore.
Yeah.
But maybe that's wrong. Sorry to give lift to the caffeine addicts out there as I clutch my mug. So days 21 through 30. I've seen a lot of people go through addiction and addiction treatment. I've spent a lot of time in those places, actually, looking at it, researching. I've got friends in that community. I'm close with that community. And so what I'd like to talk about in this context is what sorts of things help other people that we know that are addicted. What really helps, right? Not what could help, but what really helps. And are there certain people for whom it's hopeless? I mean, I don't like to hold the conversation that way, but I wouldn't be close to the real life data if I didn't ask, is it hopeless? Are there people who just will not be able to quit their substance use or their addictive behavior, despite, I have to assume, really wanting to? Yeah.
Yeah, so there are people who will die of their disease of addiction, and I think conceptualizing it as a disease is a helpful frame. There are other frames that we could use, but I do think given the brain physiologic changes that occur with sustained heavy drug use and what we know happens to the brain, it is really reasonable to think of it as a brain disease. And for me, the real window of, let's say, being able to access my compassion around people who are repeat relapsers, even when their life is so much better, when they're in recovery. Yeah, it's like a no-brainer, right? Is to conceptualize this balance and the dopamine deficit state and a balance tilted to the side of pain. And to imagine that for some people, after a month or 6 months or maybe even 6 years, their balance is still tipped to the side of pain, that on some level, that balance has lost its resilience and its ability to restore homeostasis.
It's almost like the hinge on that balance is messed up.
Exactly. And so, I mean, for someone who's never experienced addiction like yourself, maybe one way to conceptualize it is...
Well, I didn't say that.
Oh, okay.
I was not. To be clear, I was not referring to myself, but I in this example I was given, if I were, I would come clean. I would reveal that. But I think that, especially after hearing some of your lectures and descriptions of the range of things that are addictive, I think I've been fortunate. I don't have a propensity for drugs or alcohol.
Right. Okay.
I'm lucky in that way. That, frankly, if they remove all the alcohol from the planet, I'll just be relieved because no one will offer it to me anymore.
Right.
So don't send me any alcohol. It won't go to me.
Right. Imagine that you had an itch somewhere on your body, okay? And it was, we've all had that, like, whatever the source. It was super, super itchy. You can go for if you really focus, you could go for a pretty good amount of time not scratching it. But the moment you stopped focusing on not scratching it, you would scratch it. And maybe you do it while you were asleep, right? That is what happens to people with severe addiction. That balance is essentially broken. Homeostasis does not get restored despite sustained abstinence. They're living with that constant specter of that pull. It never goes away. So let me say there are lots of people with addiction for whom that does go away, and it goes away at 4 weeks for many of them. But in severe cases, that's always there and it's lingering. And it's the moment when they're not focusing on not using, it's like a reflex. They fall back into it. It's not purposeful. It's not because they want to get high. It's not because they value using drugs more than they do their family. None of that. It's that really they cannot not do it when given the opportunity and that moment when they're not thinking about it. Does that make sense?
That's a great description. And actually in that description, I can feel a bit of empathy because the way you describe scratching an itch in your sleep.
Yeah.
I've done that with mosquito bites in summer. You're scratching and you're like, you wake up scratching that mosquito bite. And I also have to admit that I've experienced not feeling like I want to pick up my phone because it's so rewarding, but just finding myself doing it.
Yes, of course.
Like, I'm not going to use this thing. I'm not going to use this thing.
Right.
And then just finding myself doing it. Like, what am I doing here?
Right.
Sort of how did I get back here again?
Right.
And I know enough about brain function to understand that we have circuits that generate deliberate behavior and we have circuits that generate reflexive behavior. And one of the goals of the nervous system is to make the deliberate stuff reflexive so you don't have to make the decision, because decision making is a very costly thing to do.
Exactly.
Decision making of any kind.
Right.
So that does really help. I want to just try and weave together this this dopamine puzzle, however, because if by week, so first phase of this 30 or 40 day detox, it's like a dopamine fast. Right. Okay. First 10 days are miserable. Middle 10 days, the clouds are out. There may be some shards of sunlight coming through. And then all of a sudden, sun starts to come out. It gets brighter and brighter. Why is it then that people will relapse, not just after getting fired from a job or their spouse leaving them, but when things are going really well?
Yes.
Is it this unconscious mechanism? Because I've seen this before, is they have a great win. I have a friend who's a really impressive creative. I don't want to reveal any more than that, but and relapsed upon getting another really terrific opportunity to create for the entire world. And I was like, how can that happen? But now I'm beginning to wonder, was it the dopamine associated with that win that opened the spigot on this dopamine system? Because it happened in a phase of a really great stretch of life.
Yeah, right. Yeah, so you raised that great point about triggers, right? And triggers are things that make us want to go back to using our drug. And the key thing about triggers, whatever they are, is they also release a little bit of dopamine, right? So just thinking about whatever the trigger is that we associate with drug use, or just thinking about drug use, can already release this anticipatory dopamine, this little mini spike. But here's the part that I think is really fascinating. That mini spike is followed by a mini deficit state. So it goes up and then it doesn't go back down to baseline. It goes below baseline tonic levels. And that's craving. Right? So that anticipation is immediately followed by wanting the drug. And it's that dopamine deficit state that drives the motivation to go and get the drug. So many people talk about dopamine is not really about pleasure, but about wanting and about motivation. And so it is that deficit state that then drives the locomotion to get it.
And earlier, your description of dopamine being involved in the desire for more, giving the sense of reward, but also movement.
Right.
I have to assume that those things are braided together in our nervous system for the specific intention of when you feel something good, then you feel the pain.
Yes.
Maybe you don't notice it. And then the next thing you know, you're pursuing more of the thing. That
and I love the way you use the word braided together. That's beautiful. And let me also just say something that I find also fascinating in my work with patients. And I see this all the time. There are people for whom bad life experiences, loss, in any form, stress in many different forms, that's a trigger. But there are absolutely people for whom the trigger is things going well. And the things going well can be like the reward of the things going well, but very often what it is the removal of the hypervigilant state that's required to keep their use in check. So it's this sense of, I want to celebrate, or this reward happened, I want to put more reward on there. And it's really, really fascinating, because when people come to that realization about themselves, that they're most vulnerable when things are going well, that's really a valuable insight, because then they can put some, things in place or barriers in place, or go to more meetings or whatever it is that they do, to protect themselves.